all of us, from the oldest to the youngest, I would argue, are probably, if not professional, at least semi-professional judgers. Okay? You look at just the spectrum of life, the different places that we find ourselves in, the different groups of people that we find ourselves in, the different activities that we enjoy and participate in. And no matter where we are, and no matter who we're with, we are always judging in some way. We're always evaluating. We're always observing our surroundings and our company with a critical eye. And now, all of us have different things that we tend to pay attention to. Different things that we care about, just different aspects of life that are more interesting than others. But we all view each other with a critical eye, and that could have to do with judging someone based on how they look. That could include judging someone based on how they dress. And here's an interesting thing. I'll just point this out as we come to this evaluating each other based on how we dress. Now, you think of perhaps a 65-year-old woman and what her lens and what her view of appropriate and nice-looking dress is going to be much different than, say, a 16-year-old boy. What's appropriate and what stands out and what looks odd, what looks good. So there's already some subjectivism that is quite obvious. And so we judge each other based on how we look. We judge each other based on how we dress. We judge each other based on how we talk. Now, even taking this well within the realm of appropriate speech, okay? We're not even talking about people who curse, people who use bad language, but even in the realm of just acceptable ways of speaking, there are different judgments that we make, okay? I'm just going to humbly reveal to you one of my things, okay? And my sister was just a terrible example of this, and I don't want to go too far on this tangent. But anyway, we evaluate each other on how we speak. Some people use the word like all the time. Like, do you understand what I'm talking about? It's like they don't have anything with any kind of content, and so instead of using, just saying what's on your mind, they have to put this kind of modifier in their speaking all the time. And so to me, I look at that, and I've been a little hard on my sister for this, and she's gotten a lot better. But I'm judging someone based on that little way that they speak. So we have how people look, we have how people dress, we have how people speak. Now we get into behavior, and now we've got this whole spectrum of things, this whole spectrum of ways that we evaluate people. Okay, this person spends their money this way, this is important to them, I think that's good, or I think that's bad. This person spends a lot of time doing this hobby. I'm not terribly interested in this hobby, so why are they wasting so much time? Or this is something that I really, really enjoy too, so wow, I wish I could spend as much time as that person does on that hobby or that activity. We're always judging people. The problem is we're always judging people according to a standard that's somehow, I guess, embedded within our own life and experience. We find ourselves making judgments whenever people are around. And like I said, and I hope that you realize this, we are very, very quick to judge. And so this morning, what Jesus is talking about, and what he's talking about this coming out of what we talked about last week, about loving your enemies and about having goodwill toward those people that have hurt you and those people that you maybe don't respect and those people that have done despicable things. And so this is kind of an outflow of what we talked about last week. But this morning, Jesus cautions us, and he gives us some instructions about judging others, or just evaluating ourselves and our own lives and those of others and their lives. And he provides, I would argue, at least 4 very clear interrelated instructions. And the first one is kind of, it seems anyway, like a huge umbrella statement. And he says, first, we must not judge. And that's verses 37 and 38. He says, do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. And then he has a little illustration that he uses. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Now, what we need to understand here is that when we think about the word judge and we think definitions, the word judge can mean different things. Is Jesus saying that we are never to exercise good judgment when it comes to ourselves and our own situations? And are we not to exercise good judgment when it comes to other people's lives and the different behavior that they have, the different situations that they find themselves in? I would argue no. That's not what he means by judging. Does it mean that we're all to kind of have our own standard for ourselves, and that just needs to stay within ourselves? And so, in my worldview, in my way that I understand things, this thought or activity or behavior, this is okay for me. I've made that decision. And so in doing that behavior, that's consistent with me. That's my standard. I'm living up to it. I'm being true to myself. But, somebody else might not have that same standard. For somebody else, that might be not a good thing, not a productive thing, perhaps even a sinful thing. And that's okay because that's their standard. And I'm to have my standard and be consistent, but I'm not to impose that standard on anybody else. And this person can have another standard, but that's got to stay kind of within their own little sphere. And this person can have their own standard. Everybody's got a different standard that they're living by, and that's cool. Just don't mix them up and don't impose them on everybody else. Is that what Jesus is telling us when he says do not judge? I don't believe it is. Okay? Jesus wants us to exercise good judgment. Jesus also wants us to have a standard. So what does he mean when he says do not judge? Well, fortunately, it doesn't just say do not judge. It has some context that Jesus puts with it. He doesn't just say do not judge and you will not be judged. He also explains further, do not condemn and you will not be condemned. And then he says forgive and you will be forgiven. And then he says give and it will be given to you. And so when Jesus is speaking about judging, when Jesus is speaking about judgment, what he is telling us, What he is telling us, and this is a big deal, this is a big picture thing, but it trickles down into every single aspect of our lives. So it is going to affect the way we evaluate and judge people based on clothing and looks and behavior and that sort of thing. But Jesus is thinking bigger. What he is saying is, do not judge. Do not put yourself in a judgment seat. Do not put yourself in a position of superiority and of authority over other people. In essence, making yourself more than you are, putting yourself in a seat that only God can occupy, and deciding whether or not I can write this person off, or whether or not this person is okay with me, or, heaven forbid, whether this person is saved or whether this person is not. Jesus is saying, do not put yourself in that position. And I think that's actually a wonderful thing that may be hard for some of us to take based on how we live our lives and how we exercise judgment in our own lives. But to me, and I hope to you, when you think this through, this is Jesus lifting a huge, huge burden off our shoulders. I do not want to be the person that is standing in judgment over someone else when we're talking about the big things. Yes, I will exercise discernment. Yes, I will exercise good judgment. But don't put me in the position of a judge of someone else. Why? Because what I see of that person is a tiny, tiny fraction of who that person is and what makes up that person and what God is doing in that person's heart and mind. Those are things that I cannot see. So heaven forbid that I put myself in a place where I am judging somebody on that kind of a scale. It's actually a burden off our shoulders when Jesus commands us not to judge. He doesn't want us to condemn people. He doesn't want us to write people off. He doesn't want us to say, okay, this person is worth my time because they do some pretty good things according to what we think pleases God. And this person is way down the road. I don't even know what to do with this person, so I'm just writing that person off. I'm not going to spend any time with them. Refusing to condemn, refusing to give up on people. Jesus desires us to be loving and not to be condemning. Jesus desires us also, as it goes on to say, he desires us to be forgiving people. And so over the course of life, we are going to be hurt by different people. And when we are hurt by different people, we can choose to judge them based on that action or that word that hurt us. And we can write somebody off in that way. And that's a response to a way that we've been hurt. Jesus says, no, I don't want you to be that way. I want you to be forgiving. Why? Is it fair to judge any man or any woman based on their worst moment? Would you want to be judged on your worst moment? I certainly wouldn't be. And so this is what Jesus is trying to head off when he says, don't judge, don't condemn, be forgiving. I mean, ultimately, God doesn't judge us on our worst moments. Thank goodness. Matter of fact, God doesn't even judge us on our best moments. Because even our best moments, brothers and sisters, are not good enough to earn salvation. God judges us on Jesus' best moments. And so all of us are guilty, and all of us need to be warned against being judgmental. But at the same time, we need to understand, too, that all of us are deserving of that kind of judgment from others as well. And so Jesus not only is pointing a finger at us and trying to protect others, we're part of the people that he's trying to protect. Jesus desires us to be merciful. And Jesus gives us an example of what that looks like. Forgiveness, generosity, mercy, and love. And he uses this image of a man with a container, and you just imagine that he is going to buy grain. Now, the grain seller, he has a couple of different options. He can just quickly pour a bag full and level it off and send the man on his way. But that's not what God is calling us to do, and that's not what God did when it came to us. This is the illustration that somebody comes with a container for grain, and the grain seller pours it full, and then he sets it down, and he takes some kind of a tamping instrument, and he tamps the grain down and makes more room, and then he pours more and pours it full again, and then he tamps it down and makes more room and pours it in again. And not only does he pour it in and level it off, but he pours it in such a way that it's just spilling over. And that's the way that God wants us to be. That's the way that we are to be after receiving that same kind of mercy and that same kind of grace from Jesus. That is how we are to act and to behave toward one another. Why? And this is kind of retrospective, but it says, because the measure we use in dealing with others is the measure that will be used with us. Now remember, Jesus is speaking this before he accomplished what he was here to accomplish. I mean, for us, this could read, because this is the measure that has been used for you, and now go and do likewise. See, Jesus doesn't teach just moderation in our judgmental attitudes. He teaches us to just abolish anything that would cause us to write someone off. Tells us to abolish anything that would cause us to lose hope for someone else. God, in essence, Jesus says, it is God's prerogative to judge. That frees us up to go and to show love and to show mercy and to show forgiveness and to express generosity without any limits. He says, go and show, because you don't have to worry about who is going to respond with good things toward God, and you don't know who is going to continue to rebel and to refuse God. We don't have to worry about that. Our job is to go out and to show love and to show the grace that God has given us. So that's the first one. Now that we understand what Jesus means by judging. Now we go on, and the rest of this passage makes a lot more sense when we have a proper understanding of what Jesus is talking about. Because secondly, in verses 39 and 40, it seems to be an encouragement from Jesus to exercise discernment. So if we're going to say judgment and discernment are the same things, all of a sudden that's not going to make sense. But Jesus certainly tells us to exercise discernment in verses 39 and 40. He tells them this parable. He says, can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into the pit? And then a student is not above his teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like his teacher. So Jesus teaches us that to be judgmental and to put ourselves in a judgment seat is counterproductive. But at the same time, we are not to ignore and we are not to not make use of our faculties of good judgment. We are to use good judgment. We are to use discernment. And he warns us. He says we need to use discernment when it comes to one another because we want to be following the right people in our life. We want to be influenced by the right people. Don't pick someone who is spiritually blind to follow, because that person is going to lead you both into a pit. And then verse 40, this other parable about a student and a teacher. You know what? We need to be discerning about the teachers that we follow. We need to be discerning about the people that we let have influence in our lives. So this is Jesus encouraging us to exercise discernment. Discernment is essential. Discernment is key. Because let's face it, so much in the world, whether intentionally or not, serves to lead us away from Jesus. And so we must be discerning. Not with who we accept or condemn, because we already decided that is not in our purview. That is the way that we are not to exercise judgment. But the way we are to exercise judgment is to be discerning and to let the right people have influence. But at the same time, being loving and merciful to everybody without qualification. The third thing we learn about judgment in these verses is that we must strive not to be hypocritical. And so I mentioned the possibility that each one of us has our own standard, and that we behave and we think and we speak according to that standard, and that they shouldn't mix. That's Jesus, what Jesus is warning us about. And we already decided that wasn't the case. Well, brothers and sisters, as I said, there is a standard. There is a standard that we must pay attention to when it comes to evaluating our own lives. There's a standard that we must pay attention to when it comes to evaluating the lives of others, as we do so in love and with the spirit of helping each other to all reach the goal together, all to reach glory. So verses 41 and 42 say, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me take the speck out of your eye,' when you fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." What it comes down to, this talk of judgment, is that there is a standard. There is one true standard. There is one true measure. Amos 7, which now we will talk about next week, talks about God's plumb line. There is a standard. Now, when we're looking around evaluating the way people dress and the way people look and the way people behave, this is not usually the standard that we are making use of. But God has given us a standard. And what Jesus is saying here is, do not be hypocrites. When you exercise judgment and discernment at all, make sure that you are using the right standard. Make sure that you are using God's standard, and make sure that you are using it on yourself before you are using it on others. You know what? I was talking to someone just recently, and I've said this before, and I've thought about it a lot. Especially when it comes to spiritual things. Especially when it comes to deeply held beliefs. Very rarely have I ever heard of anybody being converted to a different way of thinking, or converted to Christ, or converted to the gospel because someone else won an argument over them. The way the Spirit moves, the way God works in this world, is not from a place of superiority in his people. It's not from a place of judgment in his people. He works through us when we are humble enough to realize the truth that we fall so far short of the standard, so far short of the measure, That when we reach out to people and when we walk with people and when we instruct people that they too fall far short of the measure and that they are in need of a Savior and that they are in need of salvation, that's where lives change. And that's what Jesus is telling us. A hypocrite has never converted anyone. Jesus works through those who express humility. Those who connect with others in a spirit of humility, not superiority. That's where there's traction in the Christian life, and that's where there's traction in evangelism. Do not be hypocritical. What did Paul say? Christ came to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. I'd much rather talk to somebody like that than somebody that comes to me and says, you know what? Frankly, I've got it figured out. I've got it all figured out. Let me share some wisdom with you. Who would you respond to? Finally, fourth, we must be recognizable. Verse 43 and 44, no good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes, grapes from briars. The good man brings out good things of the good stored up in his heart, and the evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart, for out of the overflow of his heart his mouth speaks. Brothers and sisters, there's not much to say about this. Well, there's a ton to say about it. But I'm closing, okay? Closing it out. Fact is, we just talked about not being judgmental. We talked about being discerning. We talked about not being hypocritical. And we're going to close with the fact, the truth, that what comes out of a person's body, be it speech, be it ideas, be it behavior, that reveals what's in a person's heart. Apart from Christ, we can do nothing that is truly good and truly lasting. I mean, unbelievers, they can do good things. They can do things, good things, but I would argue that these are not things that will last. We as believers, because we have received Christ, because we have received His Holy Spirit, we have, as believers, God Himself dwelling in our hearts. Now, our job in this life is to be humble and to be submissive and to be obedient and to be vessels which God can use for His purposes in this world. And when we can buy into that, when we can jump into that without reservations, both feet in, then the fruit of our lives will be recognizable to one another, will be recognizable to the world, will certainly be recognizable to God, and that is the goal. The Christian life, that is the goal of our life of faith. Brothers and sisters, that is my prayer for us this morning. That we, like trees planted with deep roots, bear fruit. Bear fruit in our families, bear fruit in our church, bear fruit in our community. That is how God will change the world through us. Let's pray.